The locals told me the storm season on the island lasts 6 weeks. 6 weeks of salt spray that strips paint from wood, of ferries cancelled on a whim, and a kind of isolation they politely refer to as the clearing. As I hauled my rolling suitcase up the uneven slate path to the lodge, I set my own internal clock. 4 weeks. That was the deal I made with myself on the flight over from New York. I would be gone by week 4, safely back on the mainland before the weather turned from picturesque to punitive. I didn't come here for closure, or to reconnect with my roots, or any of those soft, therapeutic reasons people assign to trips like this. I came to process an asset. My aunt, a woman I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, had left me this place. It was a jagged structure clinging to the cliff edge like a loose tooth, vibrating with the wind even when the air seemed still. I wasn't stepping into a home. I was stepping into a logistical problem that needed solving. I picked up the key from the property manager at the ferry dock, a man whose face was weathered into a permanent squint. Inside, the lodge smelled of damp cedar and old, unidentifiable soap, the scent of a place that has housed many bodies but kept none. I chose a room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the one with a window facing the black drop of the cliffs. I didn't unpack immediately. Instead, I stood in the center of the room and scanned it, a habit from my work, ghostwriting memoirs, where details are currency. I noted the deep scratches in the oak floorboards, dragged there by heavy furniture. I catalogued the water stain blooming in the corner of the ceiling like a bruise. There was no welcome here, only the stubborn, indifferent weight of matter. I took my toothbrush, a cheap, bright blue plastic thing I'd grabbed at a Hudson News at JFK, and placed it on the glass shelf in the ensuite bathroom. It looked pathetic there, a sterile artifact of the modern world, invading a space that felt aggressively old. The bathroom light flickered once, a sharp electrical spasm, before settling into a low, buzzing hum. The mirror above the pedestal sink was vintage, the silver backing oxidizing around the edges into patterns that looked like black mold. I turned the tap. The pipes groaned, a guttural, mechanical sound, followed by the slap of water hitting porcelain. It sounded loud, wet, and intimately close, like someone clearing their throat in the next room, though I knew for a fact I was the only soul on this floor. I bent down, splashing freezing water onto my face to shock the jet lag out of my system. The cold stung my skin, tightening the pores. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the darkness behind my eyelids reset my equilibrium. When I lifted my head and opened my eyes, she was there, in the glass. It was me, but not entirely me. The reflection was holding the blue toothbrush, raising it to her mouth. The problem was, my hands were currently gripping the cold ceramic edges of the sink. The disconnect happened in a fraction of a second, fast enough that my brain tried to edit it out instantly. I stood frozen, water dripping from my chin, staring at my own pale face in the desilvering glass. By now, the image had corrected itself. I blinked. She blinked. I tilted my head. She tilted hers. 0 latency. The blue toothbrush was nowhere near her hand. It was sitting innocently on the glass shelf where I had left it. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the narrow doorframe, the sound of my own sharp intake of breath deafening in the small tiled space. Exhaustion, I told myself. Just the time difference, the bad wiring, the distortion of antique glass. I killed the light, backed out of the bathroom, and shut the door firmly. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands trembling in my lap. I made a decision then. I wouldn't mention this to the lawyer tomorrow. I wouldn't tell the locals. This was the first secret I would keep for this house, and I had no idea it was just the opening line of a conversation I hadn't agreed to have. The first morning on the island offered a deceptive kind of peace. The wind had dropped, leaving the sky a flat, sheet metal grey, and the ocean a rhythmic, thudding presence at the base of the cliffs. I went down to the dining room at 8, armed with a thick folder of legal correspondence. Mr. O'Malley, my aunt's solicitor, was already there. He was a man in his 60s, wearing a tweed suit that looked clean but tired, carrying the air of someone who spent his life tidying up the messes the dead leave for the living. He hadn't ordered coffee. He was just staring out the window with the patience of a stone wall. When he saw me, he nodded, a gesture devoid of any unnecessary social warmth. We sat opposite each other at a heavy oak table. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, but it was thick with the caution of two strangers forced to share a burden neither of them had asked for. O'Malley slid the will and the deed transfer papers across the wood. My aunt's signature on the final page was shaky but aggressive. The ink pressed hard into the fibre of the paper. She had left it all to me, the lodge, the scrubby acreage, and a small collection of unpaid property taxes. "She always believed you'd come back," O'Malley said, his voice flat. The sentence felt like a needle pricking my defences. I flipped through the pages quickly, avoiding his gaze, focusing on the logistics. We discussed valuation and the timeline for listing the property. He advised securing a buyer before the storm season peaked, before the tourists vanished and the island turned into a fortress. It was sound, practical advice, aligning perfectly with my exit strategy. Sign, clean, hand the keys to the agent, and leave. A tidy, sterile process, much like editing a messy manuscript into something sellable. "Of course," he said, capping his pen with a click that sounded too loud in the empty room. "The value isn't just in the land. It's in the narrative." I looked up, frowning. He shrugged, as if discussing the plumbing, the skin changer legend. "Your aunt monetized it quite effectively for the thrill-seeking demographic." I had heard the term whispered when I was a child, but hearing it from a solicitor felt absurd. "The skin changer?" I asked, keeping my voice skeptical. "They say the air here loosens the ego," he explained, looking back at his files. "Guests claim to see dead relatives, or versions of themselves. Your aunt. She didn't sell it as a ghost story. She sold it as a service. A therapy." The chill I had felt in the bathroom the night before returned, crawling up my spine. The way he used the word service made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded transactional. It sounded dangerous. O'Malley left after I signed the preliminary forms. I stood alone in the dining room, the sound of the ocean outside seeming to grow louder, more aggressive. I caught my reflection in the window pane, a rational woman from the city, a professional skeptic. But the image of the blue toothbrush moving out of sync persisted in my mind like a glitch in a video file. If I sold the place now and left, I would never know if that was a hallucination born of stress or something else. I needed to verify the data. I needed to prove my own stability to myself before I could return to my real life. I pulled out my phone and texted my editor in New York, asking to extend my leave. "I'll stay a few weeks to clear out her personal effects," I muttered to the empty room, testing the lie. I wasn't staying for the furniture. I was staying because I was terrified that the shadow in the mirror was waiting for me to come back. I tried to wear the role of innkeeper like a coat that was slightly too big, pulling the seams of my composure tight as I entered the kitchen. It was a sanctuary of brushed stainless steel and the smell of burning toast, a grounding reality after the spectral, vibrating quiet of the night before. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the dark liquid swirling into the carafe with a reassuring gurgle, before carrying it out to the dining room. The morning light was grey and thin, filtering through the salt-streaked windows like dirty water. Only one table was occupied. Mrs. Gable, A local widow who O'Malley had briefly warned me about sat by the corner window, her back rigid against the high-backed oak chair. She was a fixture of the island, a woman carved from driftwood and grief, who had been coming here for breakfast every Tuesday for 6 years, regardless of the weather or the ownership of the lodge. She didn't look up when I approached to pour her coffee. Her eyes were fixed on the empty chair opposite her, her gaze intense and expectant, as if she were watching a movie projected onto the empty air that only she could see. I set the pot down on a cork coaster, the ceramic clink sounding too loud in the hush, trying not to disturb the heavy, humid silence that hung around her table like cigar smoke. "He liked this view," she said suddenly, her voice rough with unused mornings and the damp air. "He said the waves looked like they were trying to climb in. Like burglars." I stood still, holding the silver serving tray against my chest as a shield, unsure if I was intruding on a prayer or a hallucination. "Your husband?" I asked gently. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the empty space across the table. "Thomas. He's been dead 8 years, but the lodge, it remembers him. It keeps the shape of him better than I do." She turned to me then, her eyes remarkably clear, devoid of the madness I had half expected. "Watch his hands." Or where they would be. He always tapped his ring finger twice on the table before he lifted his cup. Tap, tap. Then sip. It was a nervous tick. Something he picked up working the radios on the trawlers. She demonstrated it on the white linen tablecloth. Tap, tap. It was a precise, rhythmic motion, dry and hollow. "Sometimes," she whispered, leaning in as if sharing a conspiracy, "the island lets him come back. But the air is too thin for him to hold his own shape. He has to borrow someone else's hands to do it." I nodded politely, the way one nods at a child's imaginary friend, filing this away under local colour or coping mechanism, forcing a sympathetic smile while my rational mind dismissed it entirely as the pareidolia of a broken heart. The front door opened with a groan of hinges, letting in a gust of wet wind and a young hiker, soaked from the morning drizzle. He was a complete stranger, red-cheeked and loud, shedding a bright yellow raincoat that dripped water onto the hardwood floor. He nodded a breathless apology and took a seat 2 tables away from Mrs. Gable, facing the same window. I watched him idly as I wiped down the counter, grateful for the intrusion of something so aggressively alive. He ordered tea. When I brought it, the steam rising in the cold air, he didn't look at me. He was staring out at the same patch of violent ocean Mrs. Gable had been watching. He reached for the ceramic mug. His hand hovered over the handle for a split second. Then, his ring finger came down on the wood of the table. Tap, tap. Sharp, rhythmic, unconscious. He lifted the cup and took a sip. The breath rushed out of my lungs as if I'd been punched. I looked at Mrs. Gable. She wasn't looking at the hiker. She was smiling at her empty chair, a soft, terrifying smile of recognition, as if the sound had confirmed a private appointment. The hiker set the cup down, wiped his mouth, and did it again. Tap, tap. It wasn't just a fidget. It was a specific, muscular memory executing a script that didn't belong to the body performing it. I retreated to the small office behind the reception desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the grey metal filing cabinet. I needed to ground this in data. I needed paper, ink, dates, something to counter the impossible thing I had just witnessed. I pulled out the ledger from 2018, the year my aunt's handwriting had started to become erratic, spiking and dipping like a heart monitor. I flipped through the pages, the smell of old dust and vanilla rising from the binding, until I found the entry for March 12th. There it was. In her distinct, looping blue ink, Mrs. Gable visited for breakfast. The vessel was a travelling pharmaceutical salesman from Dublin. Noted the finger tap on the saucer. The pattern holds. The grief finds a channel. My aunt hadn't just observed this, she had catalogued it. This wasn't a ghost story told around a campfire. It was a behavioural study, recorded with clinical detachment. I traced the words with my thumb, feeling the indentation of the pen. The hiker outside was just a random tourist. I told myself desperately. A coincidence. But the ledger felt heavy in my hands. A physical proof that the script for this morning had been written years ago, and we were all just reading our lines in a play I didn't remember auditioning for. The afternoon brought a shift in pressure that I could feel in my teeth, a drop in the barometer that signalled the approach of true weather. The wind picked up, rattling the sash windows in their frames like loose bones. And with it came a new arrival who seemed immune to the encroaching gloom. His name was Elias, a freelance photographer with a canvas bag full of heavy lenses and a nervous energy that felt too jagged for the somnolent rhythm of the lodge. He checked in with a flurry of technical questions about light angles and tide charts, treating the storm season as a visual asset rather than a survival threat. I watched him unpack in the lounge, setting up tripods and cleaning filters with obsessive, ritualistic care. He wasn't interested in the lore or the quaintness of the island. He was interested in texture. The light here destroys the ego, he told me. Screwing a wide-angle lens onto a battered DSLR body, it strips everything back to the bone. That's what I'm chasing. The skins people shed when they think no one is watching. He spoke with the arrogance of someone who believes the camera is a shield against reality, unaware that in this house, observation was a two-way street. He insisted on showing me his preliminary research, spreading a portfolio of large-format prints across the coffee table, covering the majestic but scarred surface of the wood. They were stark, high-contrast black and whites taken on the island over the last decade. He had been here before, apparently, long before I inherited the place, documenting its decay. The photos were disturbing in their banality, a rusted fence wire cutting through fog, a dead bird drying on the rocks, the texture of wet slate looking like skin. The lens sees time differently, Elias murmured. Tapping a photo of the lodge's exterior, taken from the cliff edge, it captures the overlap. Long exposure doesn't just blur motion, it accumulates existence. He pushed a specific print toward me, his fingernail tapping the glossy surface. I took this 5 years ago. I was trying to catch the storm movement. The way the rain looks like static. But I got something else. I looked down at the image. It was a shot of the front porch, blurred by rain and motion, the house looking like it was melting into the landscape. But in the frame of the front window, there was a figure, sharp, still, looking directly into the lens with a terrifying clarity. I picked up the photo, bringing it closer to my face, squinting against the grain of the film. The figure standing in the window was a woman. She was wearing a heavy wool coat with a distinct, asymmetrical collar that buttoned high on the left side. I stopped breathing. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I owned that coat. I had bought it in a boutique in Brooklyn last winter, on sale, 4 years after this photo was allegedly taken. I looked closer at the face, praying for a stranger. It wasn't my aunt. My aunt had soft features, a round chin that blurred in photos. This woman had my jawline, sharp and tense. My tired eyes, with the specific bags that only developed after my divorce. My scar above the left eyebrow, visible even in the grain of the print. Interesting trick of the light. Right, Elias said, oblivious to the ice spreading through my chest, thinking I was just admiring his composition. Looks like she's waiting for someone. Or maybe she's trapped. I was looking at a picture of myself, standing in a house I hadn't yet inherited, wearing clothes I hadn't yet bought, staring out at a photographer I hadn't yet met, with an expression of knowing dread that I was only just now beginning to feel. Can I keep this? My voice sounded thin, stripped of authority, barely audible over the rising wind outside. Elias shrugged, generous with his art in the way only the detached can be sure. I have the digital negative. It's just a test shot. I took the print to my room, holding it by the edges as if it were radioactive. I placed it on the desk next to my aunt's ledger and the blue toothbrush. Then, with trembling hands, I went to the closet and pulled out the wool coat, the real one, heavy and smelling of cedar. I put it on and stood in front of the mirror. I compared the reflection to the photograph. The match was forensic. The way the collar stood up, the way the fabric folded at the elbow, it was identical. There was no way to rationalize this as a coincidence or a family resemblance. The timeline was broken. The lodge didn't just replay the past. It seemed to be pre-recording the future, or worse, trapping echoes of us that existed outside of linear time. I turned the photo face down. I didn't want to meet my own eyes anymore. I felt like a character who had just realized the book was written long before she learned to read, and the ending was already set in ink. The arrival of the third guest felt less like a check-in and more like an emergency landing. The storm had paused, leaving the air thick with a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. A small, battered hatchback pulled into the gravel drive, skidding slightly before coming to a halt near the porch. Out stepped a young woman who looked as though she had been running for days, even though her clothes were clean. Her name was Clara. She was in her early 20s, with hair dyed a defiant, unnatural shade of violet that was already fading at the roots, revealing the dark brown of something she was trying to hide. She carried a single duffel bag and a look of brittle exhaustion, the kind that comes from maintaining a mask for too long. When I handed her the registration card, her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. "Just a break," she said, her voice tight and rehearsed. "Avoiding my eyes. I just need a break from everything." "No Wi-Fi." "Right." That's what the listing said. I confirmed the lack of connection, watching her shoulders drop an inch in relief. She wasn't here for the scenery or the charm. She was here because this place was a dead zone, a blank spot on the map where she hoped her own signal wouldn't reach. I put her in the room next to Elias, hoping his chaotic energy might balance out her desperate silence. But I already felt the house tightening around her, sensing a fresh wound. 2 hours later, I found her in the hallway, outside the shared bathroom on the second floor. She was staring at the closed door as if it were the entrance to a cell. When she saw me, she jumped, clutching her towel to her chest like armor. Is there another mirror?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "One that isn't." Old Eye frowned, the memory of my own first night flashing in my mind like a warning light. "The ones in the bedrooms are newer," I lied gently. "Is something wrong with the bathroom mirror?" Clara looked at me, her eyes wide and wet, deciding in that moment whether to sound crazy or stay silent. "It's slow," she said finally. "The reflection. It's slow." I felt a cold stone drop into my stomach. "What do you mean?" She hugged herself tighter. I smiled. In the mirror, I smiled to check my teeth. But the reflection, it just stared at me for a second, and then it smiled. But it wasn't my smile. It was sharper, like it was mocking me. She took a shuddering breath. "Back home. Before I left, I was part of this group. A community. They said we had to be perfect. Mirror images of the leader. I tried so hard, but I could never get the reflection right. And now, even here, it knows. I should have reassured her. I should have told her it was just the lighting, the stress, the fatigue of travel. Instead, I felt a terrifying kinship. The house wasn't just replaying random ghosts. It was targeting specific anxieties. It was an amplifier. "Show me," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. We walked into the bathroom together. The air was colder here, smelling of damp tile and copper pipes. I stood behind her as she approached the sink. The mirror was its usual oxidized self, the black spots along the rim looking like decay. Clara looked into it. I looked over her shoulder. For a moment, it was just us, two tired women in a dim room. Then, Clara blinked. In the glass, her reflection didn't blink. It kept its eyes wide open, staring back with a predatory intensity. Then, slowly, horribly, the reflection's mouth curled up at the corners. It wasn't a smile of greeting. It was a smile of complicity. I saw my own reflection behind hers shift its weight, leaning in closer than I actually was. The glass seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. Clara let out a choked sob and backed away, knocking a bottle of lotion into the sink. The sound broke the spell. The reflections snapped back to normal, terrified, pale, perfectly synchronized. But we both knew what we had seen. The delay wasn't a glitch. It was a window. I walked Clara back to her room, promising to cover the bathroom mirror with a sheet. It was a flimsy solution, a band-aid on a broken bone, but she accepted it with pathetic gratitude. I went back downstairs to my office, my mind racing. Mrs. Gable saw her dead husband. Elias saw a past version of the house. Clara saw a distorted version of herself. And I had seen a version of me that moved independently. There was a pattern here, a logic to the haunting. It wasn't random. The lodge didn't just house ghosts. It manufactured them out of the raw material we brought with us. Our grief, our regrets, our insecurities. The house took them and gave them a body. I sat at my desk and pulled out my aunt's ledger again. I needed to see if she had understood this. I needed to know if she had been a victim of this mechanism, or its architect. The wind outside picked up again, howling around the eaves, sounding less like weather and more like a choir of voices trying to get in. I locked the office door, a futile gesture against a threat that was already inside the walls, and turned the page. My aunt's office was the only room I hadn't thoroughly purged. It was a cramped space behind the kitchen, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and dried lavender. The walls were lined with shelves that held more than just financial records. There were jars of sea glass, driftwood shaped like bones, and stacks of composition notebooks. I was looking for answers, not accounting. I bypassed the tax folders and went straight to a small, locked wooden box on the bottom shelf. The key was on the main ring I had inherited, a small brass thing I hadn't used yet. It turned with a satisfying click. Inside wasn't money or jewelry, but a single, leather-bound journal. It wasn't the guest ledger I had seen before. This was private. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, written in moments of high emotion. I opened it to a random page in the middle, dated 5 years ago, October 14th. The architect from London left today. He spent 3 nights talking to the wall in room 4. He claims the wall answered with blueprints of a house he never built. He looked lighter when he left. Lighter, but emptier. He left a part of his ambition in the plaster. I sat on the floor, surrounded by dust motes, dancing in the shaft of light from the high window, and began to read from the beginning. My aunt hadn't just run a B&B. She had been running a psychological observatory. She chronicled the guests, not by their names, but by what they brought with them: the grieving mother, the failed artist, the liar. She described the lodge not as a haunted house, but as a resonance chamber, one entry, written in bold ink, stood out. The legend of the skin changer is a metaphor we locals use to explain a biological fact of this island. The geography here, the iron in the rock, the specific frequency of the wind, it loosens the adhesive between a person and their persona. It allows the what-if selves to detach. Most people run from it. But some come here specifically to molt. I traced the words. She wasn't describing a supernatural invasion. She was describing a therapeutic process, violent and terrifying, but purposeful. The ghosts weren't spirits of the dead. They were the shed skins of the living. The husband Mrs. Gable saw wasn't Thomas. It was her own, paralyzed grief given form. The reflection Clara saw wasn't a demon. It was her own self-judgment. I turned to the last few pages, written shortly before she died. The handwriting had deteriorated into a scrawl, the ink blotchy, as if the pen had been pressed down with desperate force. "I have stayed too long," she wrote. "I thought I was the keeper, the one who watches the shedding. But I have shed too much. I look in the mirror, and I don't know which version of me is the original anymore. Is it the one writing this? Or the one I see walking down the cliff path at sunset, wearing the dress I threw away 20 years ago?" My breath hitched. The photo Elias had shown me, the woman in the window, was that my aunt? Or was it me? Or were we just iterations of the same archetype, the woman who runs away to a cliff to hide? Then I saw my own name. Nora will come. She has the same fracture in her that I do. The same desire to edit reality until it fits. She will think she is here to sell the house. She doesn't know she is here to be the next case study. The house is hungry for her silence. I slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. The dust motes seemed to freeze in the air. I wasn't an observer. I wasn't the rational narrator of this story. I was a character. My aunt had written me into the script before I even bought the plane ticket. The rationality I clung to, my forensic scanning, my detachment, was just the skin I was wearing, the skin the house was trying to peel off. I looked at the door. I could leave. I could grab my keys, drive to the ferry, and never come back. But the journal sat there, vibrating with a truth I couldn't unlearn. If I left now, I would carry the fracture with me. The house had already seen me. The mirror had already blinked. I wasn't just fighting a haunted house. I was fighting a legacy. I stood up, my knees cracking, and placed the journal back in the box. But I didn't lock it. I needed it accessible. I needed to understand the rules of this shedding before the storm hit tonight. Because if my aunt was right, and the house amplified everything, then the storm wasn't just going to bring rain. It was going to bring a deluge of everything we had tried to repress, and I wasn't sure the roof would hold. The midpoint of my stay arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the dead center of the week, the dead center of the night. I was awake, sitting in bed with my laptop open, the blue light illuminating the dust motes floating in the stagnant air. The wind outside had dropped to a low, mournful moan, a deceptive lull before the forecast storm. I heard it then, a sound that shouldn't have existed in this house. In this country, Nori, it was a nickname. A specific, childish contraction of Nora that only my father used, and he had been dead for a decade. It wasn't a voice from inside my head. It was distinct, acoustic, vibrating the air molecules in the hallway. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Rationality, my old armor, tried to deploy immediately. It's the plumbing, I told myself. It's a floorboard settling under the weight of the house. But the cadence was unmistakable. 2 syllables. Rising intonation. A question. I closed the laptop, plunging the room into darkness, and reached for the heavy flashlight I kept on the nightstand. I wasn't going to hide under the covers. If the house wanted to speak to me, I was going to record the conversation. I opened my bedroom door, the hinges screaming in the silence, and stepped out into the corridor that smelled of lavender and old dust. The beam of my flashlight cut a cone through the gloom, illuminating the floral wallpaper that my aunt had surely chosen 30 years ago. The hallway was empty, or at least, physically empty, but the air felt displaced, heavy, as if someone had just walked through it. I moved toward the stairs, my bare feet silent on the runner carpet. Then I saw the movement. At the far end of the hall, near the linen closet, a figure turned the corner. It wasn't a shadow. It was solid. A woman, about my height, wearing an oversized grey cardigan, the exact kind I wore when I was working late on a manuscript. She wasn't floating. She was walking with a purposeful, tired stride, carrying a stack of folded towels. I stopped breathing. The flashlight beam caught the side of her face as she turned. It was my profile. Not my aunt's. Mine. But it wasn't me as I was now, tense and frightened. It was a version of me that looked settled, resigned. She looked like a woman who had lived in this house for 20 years, who knew exactly which step creaked and which window rattled. She didn't look at me. She simply faded into the shadows of the linen closet, not disappearing like a ghost, but blending into the darkness as if she were a part of the house's architecture. I ran to the linen closet. I yanked the door open, shining the light inside. Nothing but stacks of white towels and the smell of cedar chips. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed a control variable. I needed to check the calibration of reality. I turned and rushed into the shared bathroom across the hall, the same one where Clara had had her breakdown. I flicked on the overhead light. It buzzed and flickered, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. I gripped the sides of the sink and stared into the mirror. "Show me," I whispered, my voice shaking. I stared at my reflection. For 3 seconds, it was just me, pale, wide-eyed, terrified. Then I blinked. The reflection didn't. The woman in the glass kept her eyes open, staring back with a calm, forensic detachment that I absolutely did not feel. Then, slowly, she tilted her head to the left. I forced my head to remain upright, fighting every mirror neuron in my brain. We were out of sync, not just by a fraction of a second, but by an entire intention. She was studying me. She was the observer, and I was the specimen. The house wasn't just replaying the past, it was projecting a potential future where I stayed, where I became the caretaker, where I became the ghost. I backed out of the bathroom, leaving the light on, leaving that other version of myself trapped in the glass. I retreated to my room and locked the door, sliding the heavy brass bolt home. I sat on the floor, my back against the wood, shivering uncontrollably. I looked at the aunt's journal, sitting on the desk where I had left it. I had been reading it as a skeptic, as an editor reviewing a manuscript full of plot holes, but I had misread the genre. This wasn't a ghost story I was observing from the outside. I was a character in the text. My aunt had written me into the narrative before I ever arrived, and the house had just confirmed my casting. The Nora I heard wasn't a memory, it was a lure. The woman in the hallway wasn't a haunt. She was a vacancy sign. The realization washed over me with the cold clarity of the ocean tide. I wasn't here to sell the house. I was here to see if I fit the skin it had prepared for me. And the terrifying part, the part I couldn't admit even to the empty room, was that the cardigan looked comfortable. It looked like it fit. The storm hit at sunset, and it wasn't just weather, it was a siege. The wind didn't just blow, it impacted the house with the physical force of a battering ram. The windows bowed inward, the glass groaning under the pressure, and the rain sounded like gravel being thrown against the siding. The electricity failed almost immediately, plunging the lodge into a darkness that felt heavy and pressurized. I moved through the ground floor with a flashlight, checking the latches, feeling the vibrations of the storm traveling up through the floorboards into my bare feet. I wasn't an innkeeper anymore. I was the captain of a sinking ship. The air pressure inside the house dropped so sharply my ears popped. I could hear them upstairs, my 3 guests. They weren't sleeping. The house, energized by the static and the violence of the atmosphere, was waking up, and it was dragging their traumas to the surface. I heard Mrs. Gable talking in the dining room, a low, urgent conversation with no one. I heard the shutter of Elias's camera clicking frantically in the lounge. And from Clara's room, I heard a sound that chilled my blood, the sound of glass breaking, followed by a silence that was far worse than the noise. I ran up the stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dust raised by the vibrating walls. I found Mrs. Gable in the hallway. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at a shadow cast by the grandfather clock. "Thomas," she whispered, reaching out a hand. "You're wet." "You're so wet." The shadow didn't move. But for a second, in the strobe light effect of the lightning flashing through the window, I saw the shadow take the shape of a man in heavy oilskins. I didn't have time to process it. Elias burst out of his room, his camera in hand, his eyes wide and manic. "The shutter speed," he yelled over the thunder. "I can't get it fast enough." "They're moving too fast." He showed me the display on his camera. The image was a blur of motion, but in the center, perfectly sharp, was a face. It wasn't his. It was a younger, hungrier version of him, looking back with contempt. "That's not me," he stammered, backing away. "That's the man I eliminated to get this job." The house was compressing time, layering every version of them on top of each other until the present cracked under the weight. Then Clara screamed again. I pushed past Elias and kicked open her door. The room was illuminated by the erratic flashes of lightning. Clara was on the floor, surrounded by shards of the vanity mirror she had smashed. But she wasn't looking at the broken glass. She was looking at the standing full-length mirror in the corner, the one I had forgotten to cover. Standing in that mirror was not Clara. It was the perfect girl she had run away from, perfectly groomed, smiling a beatific, judgmental smile, holding a jagged piece of glass. The reflection raised the glass to its arm. Clara, on the floor, mimicked the motion, her hand hovering dangerously close, trapped in a sympathetic magic she couldn't break. "No," I screamed, lunging forward. I tackled Clara, knocking the shard from her hand. We rolled on the floor, tangling in the rug. I looked up at the mirror. The reflection didn't stop. It looked at me. And then, beside the perfect girl, I saw another figure in the glass. It was me. The caretaker me, from the hallway. She reached out from inside the mirror and held the perfect girl's hand, stopping the harm. My doppelganger saved her. The cognitive dissonance was too much. Seeing myself, an autonomous, the separate version of myself, intervene in the physical reality broke something in my mind. The room spun. The sound of the storm escalated into a deafening roar that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming, "Let me in!" I grabbed Clara and dragged her into the hallway, shouting for Elias and Mrs. Gable to get away from the windows, to get to the center of the house. We huddled together in the interior corridor, a knot of terrified humanity in the belly of a beast that was trying to digest us. The walls shook. The air tasted of ozone and old panic. I remember holding Mrs. Gable's hand, feeling the cold arthritis in her fingers. I remember Elias weeping over his camera. And then there is a gap. A white noise in my memory. I don't know if I passed out, or if the house simply took those minutes from me as payment. When I blinked again, the grey light of dawn was filtering through the transom window, and the wind had died. We were alive, but I knew, with a certainty that settled in my marrow, that we hadn't just survived a storm. We had been rewritten. The morning after the storm was aggressively silent. The sun came up over a sea that looked like bruised iron, flat and exhausted. The lodge had held, but it bore the scars of the night. Shingles littered the lawn like fallen scales. The front porch was slick with seaweed thrown up by the waves. Inside, the 3 guests moved like sleepwalkers, packing their bags with slow, deliberate movements. They didn't speak about what they had seen. The shame of the night, the vulnerability we had all exposed, hung in the air like humidity. I wasn't ready to let them leave. Not yet. I needed to understand the mechanics of the trauma we had shared. I needed to know if it was mass hysteria induced by low pressure, or if the geography itself was culpable. I found a local engineer, a man named O'Connor who maintained the island's radio tower, and asked him to bring his equipment to the cliffs. He looked at the house, then at me, with a knowing pity. The wind plays tricks here. Miss, he said, unloading a decibel meter and a frequency analyzer. But I'll measure the rock if it makes you sleep better. We spent the morning mapping the acoustic profile of the cliff face directly below the lodge. O'Connor explained the physics as we worked. The basalt formation was concave, a natural parabolic reflector. When the wind hits this from the northeast, he pointed to a jagged outcropping. It creates a standing wave. Infrasound. Below 20 hertz, he showed me the needle on his analyzer jumping even in the light breeze. You can't hear it, but your body feels it. It causes dread, nausea, hallucinations. It vibrates the fluid in your eyes, making you see things in your peripheral vision. I nodded, writing it all down. It made sense. It was rational. The ghosts were just physics. The skin changing was just a biological reaction to low-frequency vibration. I felt a surge of relief. I could explain this. I could sell the house with a disclosure form about acoustic anomalies and walk away clean. I thanked O'Connor and paid him. I walked back to the house, armed with the sword of science, ready to slay the dragon. But I had one piece of data O'Connor didn't. During the storm, I had left my digital voice recorder running on the mantelpiece in the lounge. I sat in my office and plugged it into my laptop, pulling up the waveform. I scrolled to the peak of the storm, around 2 a.m., the time of the blackout in my memory. The waveform was a chaotic mess of static and wind noise. I put on my noise-cancelling headphones and applied a high-pass filter to strip out the rumble. Underneath the roar of the wind, there were voices. Not the guests. Not me. It was a layer of whispers. Hundreds of them, overlapping. I isolated a 5-second segment. It wasn't random noise. It was a sentence, repeated in a loop. I forgive you. Then another voice. Deeper. I'm still here. And then, cutting through the static with terrifying clarity, a voice that sounded exactly like my Aunt Nora. Don't leave the mirror uncovered. The infrasound theory explained the dread. It explained the hallucinations. But it didn't explain how the wind knew my name. It didn't explain how a geological formation could articulate the specific forgiveness Mrs. Gable needed to hear, or the warning I needed to survive. I took the headphones off. My hands were cold. The scientific explanation hadn't killed the mystery. It had just given it a body. The house was a machine. Yes, A machine made of stone and geometry. But something was operating it. The infrasound was just the carrier wave. The signal. The signal was us. Our memories, our dead, our guilt. The house recorded us and played us back until we couldn't tell the difference between the echo and the voice. I looked out the window at my guests, loading their cars. I couldn't just send them away with a brochure about standing waves. That would be a lie. I needed to offer them something better. I needed to offer them a ritual. If the house was a machine for breaking us down, maybe I could figure out how to put it in reverse. I picked up the recorder and the ledger. I had a hypothesis, but to prove it, I would have to bring them all back into the room where they had almost broken, and ask them to do the one thing people on this island never did: tell the truth while the lights were on. I didn't call it a séance. I called it a calibration. After breakfast, when the light was harsh and unforgiving, stripping the romance from the storm damage, I asked everyone to stay in the lounge. I treated the room like a studio I was soundproofing. I closed the heavy velvet drapes to kill the glare. I went to the windows and wedged folded pieces of cardboard into the sashes to stop the rattling. I turned off the refrigerator in the kitchen so the hum wouldn't interfere. I wanted a baseline of silence. If O'Connor's theory about standing waves was correct, we needed to dampen the resonance. If my aunt's theory about the skin changing was correct, we needed to stop performing for the house and start performing for ourselves. Mrs. Gable sat in her usual chair, her hands folded over her purse. Elias stood by the fireplace, cleaning a lens with nervous, jerky movements. Clara sat on the floor, hugging her knees, refusing to look at the covered mirror I had brought down from her room. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck waiting for rescue. But I knew no boat was coming. The house amplifies what we bring into it, I told them, my voice sounding flat and clinical in the dampened room. It's an echo chamber. The storm made it loud, but the signal is ours. To stop the echo, we have to change the input. We have to say the thing we've been afraid to say to the empty air. Mrs. Gable went first. It wasn't bravery, it was exhaustion. She turned her chair to face the empty corner where she had claimed to see her husband for years. "I don't see him today," she said, her voice trembling. "I usually try to summon him. I hold my breath until my head spins." Just to see that flicker, I handed her the ledger. Open to the page where my aunt had recorded the finger-tapping habit. It wasn't a ghost. "Martha," I said gently. "It was a loop." Mrs. Gable touched the paper. "I know," she whispered. "He didn't tap his fingers because he was happy. He did it when he was impatient. When he wanted to leave, she looked up, tears finally spilling over. Not of fear, but of ugly, necessary truth. I keep bringing him back because I was relieved when he died. He was hard to live with. And I've punished myself for that relief every breakfast for 8 years. The air in the room seemed to shift, lightening physically. Elias stepped forward next. He threw a stack of his glitch photos onto the coffee table. "It's not a time slip," he said, looking at the blurred face of his younger self. I staged the first one. 5 years ago, I wanted a haunted portfolio to sell to a gallery in Berlin. But then, I couldn't stop seeing it. I sold out my painting career for this cheap trick. And now the trick is the only thing that feels real. He crushed the photo in his hand. I'm not haunted by the house. I'm haunted by the hack I became. Then it was Clara's turn. I pulled the sheet off the full-length mirror. She flinched, hiding her face. "I can't," she sobbed. "She'll be perfect." "She'll hate me." I stood next to the mirror, not looking at it, looking only at her. "She isn't perfect. Clara. She's just a flat image. She has no depth." I opened my aunt's journal to the last entry. The one about the fracture. I read it aloud, my voice steadying her panic. The skin we shed is not the enemy. It is just the shell that no longer fits. We are not the shell. We are the soft thing underneath that is trying to grow. Clara looked up. Slowly, painfully, she crawled toward the glass. She stood up. She forced herself to look. The reflection hesitated. I saw the lag, the forensic glitch, but Clara didn't look away. I did it, she said to her reflection. I told them where he was. I'm a snitch. And I'm glad I did it. The reflection didn't smile its creepy, beatific smile. It just stood there, looking tired, looking human, looking exactly like a girl with bad dye and a broken heart. The delay vanished. The sync returned. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass and breathed. We sat there for a long time. The wind outside was still blowing, but inside, the frantic vibration had stopped. The house felt inert. It was just wood and plaster, stripped of its malice. The ghosts, the husband, the younger artist, the perfect girl, the caretaker me. They had receded because they were no longer needed to scream the subtext. We had said the subtext out loud. I looked around at my guests. They looked wrecked, hollowed out, but they also looked solid for the first time since they arrived. They weren't characters in a ghost story anymore. They were just people in a room. I realized then that my aunt's service wasn't about seeing the dead. It was about creating a space so pressurized that the truth was the only thing that could survive. I closed the journal and placed it on the mantelpiece. The experiment was over. The data was collected. Now we just had to figure out how to leave the lab without taking the contamination with us. The next morning brought the ferry, a white speck growing larger on the steel-grey horizon, cutting through the calm water with the inevitability of a closing credit. The air on the island had changed. The ozone smell of the storm was gone, replaced by the clean, biting scent of drying kelp. The lodge felt different, too. It felt lighter, as if the structural integrity was no longer dependent on the tension of our secrets. I stood on the porch, watching the guests pack their cars. There was no hurried scrambling, no panic. Their movements were slow and deliberate, the movements of people who were careful about what they were putting into their suitcases, checking to make sure they weren't accidentally packing a ghost. I held the clipboard with their final bills, but the transaction felt symbolic. They were paying for the room, but the real currency had already been exchanged in the lounge the night before. I watched them emerge one by one, blinking in the sunlight, looking like patients being discharged from a long stay in a fever ward. The house had processed them, chewing up the versions of themselves they couldn't carry anymore and spitting out something raw but viable. I stood there, the ledger heavy in my hand, feeling less like an innkeeper and more like a gatekeeper, checking passports at a border crossing between the living and the remembered. Mrs. Gable was the first to leave. She stopped at the corner table in the dining room on her way out. She didn't sit. She didn't wait for a tap. She simply placed her hand on the back of the empty chair, patted it once, firmly, definitively, and walked away. She wasn't leaving Thomas behind. She was leaving the performance of Thomas. Elias came down next. He was carrying his camera gear, but the memory card from the storm night was sitting on the reception desk. "Keep it," he said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Or burn it." "I don't care. I'm going back to charcoal. It's messier, but at least I make the marks myself." He looked older, less manic, stripped of the pretentious armor he had worn like a costume. Then came Clara. She had done something drastic in the shared bathroom. Her violet hair was gone, cut short into a rough, choppy pixie cut that exposed the nape of her neck. It wasn't a good haircut, but it was an honest one. She wasn't the perfect girl anymore, and she wasn't the fugitive. She was just Clara, "I'm going to call my mum," she said, her voice steady. "When I get to the mainland, I'm going to tell her everything." Each of them was leaving a skin behind, molted on the floor of the lodge like the translucent casing of a cicada. When the last car crunched down the gravel drive, silence rushed back into the lodge to fill the vacuum. It wasn't the pregnant, watching silence of my arrival. It was just empty. I went into my office and opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a new email from Mr. O'Malley. Subject: updated offer. The buyer was serious. The number was higher than the pre-storm valuation. It was enough money to buy a condo in Brooklyn, to take a sabbatical, to never edit another poorly written memoir again. It was the escape hatch I had programmed into my plan from day one. All I had to do was type yes and forward the PDF. I hovered my cursor over the reply button. I looked at the wall where my aunt's map of the island hung. I looked at the ledger sitting on the desk, thick with the handwriting of the dead and the shed skins of the living. Selling the place meant closing the book. It meant the skin changer legend would become just that, a legend. A marketing hook for a boutique hotel developer who would paint over the damp spots and install Wi-Fi. The decision sat in my chest, a physical weight. I knew the cost of staying. I knew the isolation, the damp, the constant negotiation with the uncanny. But I also knew the cost of leaving, the gnawing sense that I had walked away from the only place where the acoustics were tuned to my specific frequency. I didn't reply. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, reflecting my own face back at me. I walked out to the cliff edge, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I looked down at the rocks where O'Connor and I had measured the sound waves. I thought about the acoustic anomaly, the geological trick that made this place a prism for the human psyche. Science explained the how, but it didn't explain the why. It didn't explain why I felt, for the first time in 15 years, that I was standing on solid ground. I had come here to process an asset, to dissect a legacy with forensic tools. Instead, I had become the archivist. My aunt hadn't trapped me. She had recognized me. She knew I was the only one who could read the handwriting in the dark. I watched the ferry pull away from the dock, carrying Mrs. Gable, Elias, and Clara back to the real world. They were leaving lighter. I was staying heavy, anchored by the weight of the ledger and the secrets it held. I turned my back on the ocean and looked at the house. The front door was open, waiting. The question wasn't whether I could sell it. The question was whether I dared to stay and live in the grey zone, or if I would take the easy money and carry the haunting with me as just another story I told at parties. The silence that followed the departure of the last ferry was different from the silence of my arrival. It wasn't the held breath of a predator waiting to pounce. It was the heavy, satisfied exhalation of a machine that had finished its cycle. I spent the afternoon performing the physical rituals of the innkeeper, stripping the beds where Mrs. Gable, Elias, and Clara had slept. I handled the linens with the care of a crime scene investigator, bagging evidence. In room 4, I found a lens cap Elias had forgotten under the nightstand. In the shared bathroom, the smell of Clara's cheap vanilla body spray still lingered faintly in the grout, a ghost scent that bleach couldn't quite kill. I gathered these remnants, the receipts, the stray hairs, the empty water bottles, and put them in a trash bag. It felt like I was disposing of molted skins, the dry, papery husks left behind by cicadas. The house didn't rattle today. The wind was a low hum, a background frequency that felt almost companionable. I walked through the hallway where I had seen my doppelganger, waiting for the flicker, the lag, the glitch. But the shadows were just shadows. The Nora whisper didn't come. The house had fed. It had processed the trauma we offered it. and now it was dormant, digesting the energy of our confessions. I realized then that the haunting wasn't a constant state, it was a transaction, and the transaction was complete. I went down to my office and sat in the chair that still molded to the shape of my aunt's spine. The laptop screen was open to the email draft I had started 3 weeks ago. Subject: listing agreement, lodge, sale. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, a rhythmic demand for a conclusion. I looked at the digital numbers of the offer. It was a lifeline. It was a ticket back to a world of climate-controlled offices, predictable narratives, and mirrors that only showed you what you expected to see. I could click send, lock the door, and mail the keys to O'Malley. I could go back to being a ghostwriter, editing other people's lives while hiding my own. But my hand hovered over the trackpad. I thought about the ledger. I thought about the acoustic anomaly that O'Connor had mapped but couldn't fully explain. If I sold this place, the new owners would renovate. They would insulate the walls. They would fix the vibrating pipes. They would silence the house. And in doing so, they would destroy the only place on earth where people like Mrs. Gable, people like me, could go to look their grief in the eye. I hit the backspace key. I held it down until the email vanished. Then I typed a new subject line. Subject: winter maintenance schedule. I wasn't staying because I was trapped. I was staying because I was the only one who knew how to operate the machinery. Before I closed the office for the night, I needed to perform one last audit. I pulled the digital recorder from my pocket, the one I had used to capture the voices in the storm. I needed to be sure. I needed to know where the physics ended and the impossible began. I put on the headphones and scrubbed the audio file to the timestamp, 0214. The moment of the blackout. O'Connor's theory of infrasound explained the dread, the hallucinations, the visual vibrations. It was a neat, clean, scientific wrapper, but as I listened to the static wash over me, I heard it again. Under the wind, under the groan of the joists. A voice. It wasn't the collective whisper I had heard before. It was a single, clear sentence, spoken in a voice that was undeniably my own, but older. Rougher, the ink is the anchor, I froze. I hadn't spoken during that recording. I had been unconscious, or missing time, and the voice on the tape sounded like it was speaking from the future, giving instructions to the past. I looked at the ledger on the desk. The ink is the anchor. The anomaly wasn't just reflecting us. It was archiving us outside of linear time. Science could explain the standing wave, but it couldn't explain how the house knew what I would need to hear before I knew I needed to hear it. This was the detail I would never publish. This was the variable that would keep me awake at night. The house wasn't just a mirror, it was a library, and I was just the latest volume. I walked upstairs to room 1, the best room facing the sea, which I had prepared for the next arrival, whenever that might be. On the bedside table, next to the lamp, I placed a fresh, bound notebook. Its cover was stark white, unblemished, smelling of new paper and potential. Next to it, I laid a heavy fountain pen, filled with indelible black ink. This was the contract. This was the service. I wasn't offering a bed and breakfast. I was offering a blank page in a world that insisted on filling every margin. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark ocean. The storm season was over, but the need for shedding skins never really ended. I touched my reflection in the cold glass. She didn't blink out of sync this time. She just looked back, tired but solid, wearing the face of a woman who had finally decided which version of herself to keep. I turned off the light, leaving the room ready. The wind picked up outside, scratching at the glass like a polite guest asking to be let in. If you ever find yourself driving down a gravel road in Ireland, running from a version of yourself you can't stand anymore, look for the sign. The vacancy light is on, and the book is